Hi, Kirk. Are you there? Looks like we have one attendee at this point. I am going to go ahead and get started, and maybe we'll get some others that'll join us along the way. This is Craig Garber. I am the ADA coordinator here at the IHSA. My other responsibilities are to facilitate cross country for boys and girls, track and field for boys and girls, and swimming and diving, boys and girls. And also I facilitate Scholastic Bowl. And so I want to thank you for joining me to learn more about ADA topics as they pertain to the IHSA. So our plan for this webinar is to cover IHSA policy for accommodations for students with disabilities. So we'll kind of talk about the policy. We'll talk about the process for requesting an accommodation. We'll look at programs for students with disabilities that we offer here at the IHSA. And we'll also, at the end of the presentation, I'll go over my role as the ADA coordinator, and I'll provide some contact information for you as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. You may or may not have joined one of these webinars in past months. But if you have questions at any point, feel free to, you can either unmute your mic. There should be a little mic next to your name, or up at the top of your screen. There's settings for your mic. You can unmute it and just ask away, or you can type in the attendee chat, which Kurt Gibson, who's helping me today, has kind of spearheaded that, and he is addressing those. So feel free to type in the attendee chat your questions, and we'll just go from there. So let's go ahead and get started with things. Back in 2012, the IHSA established a policy to consider reasonable accommodations for athletes with disabilities. The intent is to provide full and equal opportunity for students with disabilities to be integrated in IHSA sports and activities whenever possible. As far as the definition of disabilities, we have adopted the definition as provided within the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the policy also establishes that the IHSA will not discriminate on the basis of disability when it comes to our services, programs, and activities. This slide identifies ways that the IHSA promotes inclusion for students with disabilities. We will address most of these, I think, in depth later in the slideshow. But first and foremost, as I mentioned, we allow for requests for accommodations for disabled student athletes, both for the regular season and our state series contests. We provide disabled divisions during the state series in certain sports. So I'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. We conduct a wheelchair basketball tournament at the Peoria Civic Center. I know it says 3 and 4A boys state basketball finals here, but it's actually during the 1A and 2A boys state basketball finals. And we conduct an annual road race in which we promote and encourage the participation of both able-bodied and disabled student athletes who attend IHSA member schools. And lastly, we have partnered with Special Olympics to provide more opportunities for the intellectually disabled student athletes. Like I said, I'll touch in more depth on these a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit about how to request an accommodation for students with disabilities. So as far as who can request an accommodation, this can be initiated by student participants. It can be initiated by parents, coaches, administrators, but the request has to be signed and submitted by the school's official representative, which typically is the principal or the AD. An accommodation request form is required when an accommodation for a disability would otherwise be a violation of IHSA bylaws, policies, and procedures or rules of the sport. I will cover some examples of this in a little bit. But as far as this goes, when we review accommodation requests, that's the first thing we look at. Would this otherwise be a violation of IHSA bylaws, policies, and procedures, or rules of the sport or activity? As far as what the IHSA considers, we will address each accommodation request on a case-by-case basis, looking at a variety of factors that are unique to each request. But general considerations include the three things listed here: whether the accommodation will transform the nature of the sport or activity or create an advantage for the student athlete or student participant. We look at whether the accommodation will create undue financial or administrative burdens, and whether the accommodation will create a health or safety risk to the participant or others. Lastly, as far as when should a request for accommodations be submitted, they can be submitted at any time, but it is preferred that they be submitted before contests begin for that sport or activity. I generally receive most requests at the beginning of a sports season. So I get a lot of requests at the beginning of the fall, at the beginning of the winter, and the beginning of the spring sports seasons. And then who should they go to after completing a request? They can be emailed to me, and my email address is provided on this slide, or they can be faxed, and the fax number is provided here, or they can be mailed, and our mailing address is also provided here. So that's how we can receive those. If you deem that you have a situation that requires an accommodation request, you can find the request in a couple of different locations, either through our website or through your school center account. So the picture or the screenshot on the left is how you would get to it from the website. So you'd first click on Resources, and then once the drop-down appears, you're going to click on Download Center. And then once you get into the Download Center, the very first link in the Download Center is the one you want, Request for Accommodations. It's a PDF. If you go through the School Center and you log in, your home screen or main menu in the School Center, it would be the A tab, which is Accommodations for Students with Disabilities. So either way, that will get you what you need in order to request an accommodation. Let's look at the form a little bit. This is what the accommodation request form looks like. It will be divided into 3 parts, and it's pretty straightforward. Part 1 is for part 1 consists of the entire first page. It's only a 2-page form. Part 1 is for the parent and the student to complete. So basically, a couple of things I want to point out with part 1 here that I see that parents and students typically don't include or may not include correctly. In the first section here, the personal information, the year in school, sometimes I'll receive these with, they're not thinking of it as a grade, but the actual year. So they may put in that blank space 2018-19. Well, I'm looking for the grade in school, whether they're a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. So sometimes I see that as being problematic, and I have to reach back out to the school and gather that information. Probably the biggest issue that I see on page 1 of the form is the next section, the accommodation requested. Sometimes I'll see parents and students just state in there what the problem is or what the disability is, and they don't specifically request what they're looking for from the IHSA or what they're looking for the IHSA to approve. It may be a waiver of a bylaw. It may be that they, wear a glucose monitor during a volleyball contest, something of that nature. They need to specifically state that. And it's not until the next section, reason, that they would state why they need that accommodation. The last part on here before they sign is the records that are, that are attached and are related to the request. If it's a first-time request, we ask that you send those records. So it might be an IEP, a 504 plan. There may be pictures that we need, medical records, those types of things. Anything that you think would support the request, please send that along. Sometimes we ask for transcripts or attendance records, those types of things. So think through, what they're requesting, and then what supporting documentation would be critical for us to consider with the request. Also, if this request is a second-time request, let's say it was approved last year, we wouldn't need all that information unless things have changed for the student athlete. So you would just simply send the form in again without all that attached information. Lastly, it is required that both the student and the parent sign and date the form. Okay, so this is page 2 of the request, and the second part is for the principal or athletic director to complete. Your signature would verify that you've reviewed the request and that the student has a statement of disability on file with the school. And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes there may not be a statement of disability on file at the school, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't sign this and send it on. There are times where a student doesn't have a disability, but may need something for, we often see this with diabetic students, those types of things. There is no statement of disability at the school, but, in that case, you would still sign it and send it on to us. And then part 3 is for the IHSA executive director to complete. So the IHSA executive director is going to complete this within 10 days per policy. So once he completes this, he's going to send it back to the school, and he will do one of 3 things. It will either be approved, denied, or approved in part. And so obviously if it's approved in part, that means that part of the request was approved and the other part was denied. And oftentimes there's a section there that he may include rationale or stipulations, for the request. And there are sometimes attachments that come along with the completed request. So in other words, like I said, the executive director will complete this within 10 days. One of those 3 things will be, one of those 3 decisions will be stipulated on the request. And then there could be some rationale or attachments that go along with it that give you some further guidance. All right, so this slide basically depicts some examples of accommodations requests that we see. Some requests are very complex, as noted here, and require quite a bit of analysis. And then we get some that are very common. The examples listed on this slide would be ones that we commonly see. And this just gives you an idea of the types of things that we see in our office that if they come up for you, then you'll know what to do. You'll know where to go to get the form and submit that accommodation request to us. But interpreting event instructions to a hearing impaired track and field athlete may be a request, or having someone out there who will give them a visual cue to start a race in track and field. Another one, allowing for a guide runner using IHSA guidelines during cross-country competition for a visually impaired runner. Allowing students who have medical conditions, making them unable to walk for long periods of time, to use a motorized golf cart during golf competitions. And then, as I mentioned before, allowing a diabetic volleyball player to wear a glucose monitor during volleyball competition. Another one we see typically is in water polo. Water polo athletes are restricted from wearing goggles. So if there's a student who wears glasses and needs to wear rec specs, during a water polo match, then they'll send us an accommodation request, and we typically ask for pictures on those because we just have to confirm that they're not prescription goggles. So those are requests that we generally see, and also are generally approved. As I mentioned before, we have some sports with separate divisions for athletes with disabilities, and I've listed those on this slide. We have a wheelchair division in both bowling and track and field. That's available to students who use a wheelchair for mobility or sports. In swimming, we have a disabled division in our state series for those who are physically or visually disabled. And in swimming, we do require that they have a formal Paralympic classification. And I've noted that on this slide. They would have to be an S1 up to an S13 swimmer per the Paralympic classification guidelines. I have on the athletes with disabilities, on the swimming for athletes with disabilities webpage on our website. There's a video on there that would show you how to enter an athlete with disabilities into our state series for swimming. And it also talks more in depth about the classification process and what we require. So if you have anybody who's interested in that, if you're a swimming coach or comes to you and says, we have somebody who wants to swim, who's physically or visually disabled, I would say check that page out. And there's, like I said, there's a presentation on there that shows how to enter them and how to get classified. As I mentioned before, the IHSA road race takes place early June. We got that off the ground a couple of years ago, and we do offer opportunities here for disabled athletes to run in this road race. There's actually 3 divisions. So non-disabled girls and boys would be 2 of the divisions. And then there's an athletes with disabilities division also. You can find more information out about the road race by going to the link on this page. And we also have a partnership with Special Olympics Illinois, and we provide opportunities for students with intellectual disabilities through this partnership through something called Unified Sports and Activities. Basically, Unified Sports and Activities means that we are that the Special Olympics is offering, with our assistance, opportunities for Special Olympics athletes to pair up with able-bodied athletes to compete in, and represent their school in competition. So currently, Unified Sports and Activities at IHSA State Series events, we have a unified basketball tournament that goes in conjunction currently with our 3 and 4A boys basketball tournament in March. And then we also have a unified bass fishing tournament that is in conjunction with our bass fishing state finals. There are currently other possibilities for unified offerings being discussed. This year, we piloted unified dance at the IHSA dance state finals, and there are discussions currently taking place about potentially offering unified swimming. All right, so my contact information is listed on this slide, and I've also bulleted my responsibilities here. So if you have questions about accommodations or requests for accommodations, you can reach out to me. If you send in accommodation requests, again, you would submit them to me. I most commonly get them through email, but again, you could fax or mail them to the office. I will review those. Oftentimes, I will reach out and ask for additional information, or I'll ask questions about the accommodation request. Another role is of mine as the ADA coordinator is to help promote and publicize opportunities for student athletes with disabilities within the IHSA. We send out an all-school mailing, and I'll publicize some things that way. I also have developed a web page for all of our disabled sports, or all the programs and activities that we offer for students with disabilities. So there's information out there on our website. I do webinars like this to get information out there. Another one of my roles is I chair the Athletes with Disabilities Advisory Committee. They meet twice a year and make recommendations as far as our sports and activities offerings and programs. And then I just act as a resource for parents and students and schools, IHSA staff, and board of directors in regard to student participants with disabilities. So with that, are there any questions that I could answer? That concludes the presentation on ADA. All right. Well, I'm available again at any point. If there are any questions that come up beyond this, then let me know, and I will certainly get back to you. And I hope that this was helpful. And that concludes the presentation on ADA.